So let's go ahead and dig right into this nurture side of things and start talking about, right, how our human experience impacts our life. So what I want you to do is I want you to make another T-chart in your notes. Just a quick T-chart on the left side. You're going to write parents, and on the right side, you are going to write peers. I'm going to say a few kind of traits that people have, and I want you to write if you think that this trait is more influenced by your parents or if it's more influenced by your peers. So with that, you have your T-chart, parents on the left, peers on the right. I'm going to read those traits, and I want you to kind of denote which one is more impactful. So, cooperation, self-discipline, charitableness, learning cooperation skills, so like how you cooperate, work in groups, choice of music, good and bad habits, responsibility, education and career path, religion, style of interaction with authority figures, so how are you interacting with those in quote unquote power? That could be a teacher, that could be an adult, that could be a police officer, whomever. Learning the path to popularity. How do you become popular? I want to be popular. Last one then, choice of clothing and other cultural choices, so fashion. So you've taken a second, you've denoted which of these traits you believe is more influenced by your parents and which of those are more influenced by your peers. Overall, after research has been done, generally people agree that parents have influence over certain characteristics and our friends and peer groups have influence over others. So here's kind of a overview. See if your ideas match up. If they don't, why do you think that is? And this is going to give us some insight into, like, again, why are we behaving the way that we do based on things that we have learned throughout our lives, right? Think about like charitableness, right? I remember when I was like a little kid and I got an allowance from my parents. I had 3 envelopes in my room and I had, say, I don't even remember how much money I got. Let's say $10 was my allowance. I had to put 20% into charity, right? I had to put 20% into my savings, and then I could keep the rest. So $2 went into my charity, $2 went into my savings, and then I got to keep $6, right? And ever since I was like from 2 until I didn't get an allowance in high school, probably like through 7th or 8th grade or whatever, right? I did that practice, right? That's my parents, specifically my mother, teaching me the value of charitableness, right? Like being able to give back. Yes, I'm making money, but I'm not going to keep it all. I'm going to save some and I'm going to donate some, right? So what influences our behavior and how we perceive the world, right? And it's important to recognize that all of this then comes together to talk about like how it affects ultimately our brain development, right? Our environment gives us experience, and that experience influences how we behave. So all of this kind of potential influence of environment on brain development, it all starts in the womb. It starts as we are embryos in our mother's tummies, right? Tummies, uterus, whatever you want to say. Some embryos get exposed to differing nutrition and varying levels of toxic agents, right? Depending on if your mother is vegan or not, right? You may be exposed to certain vitamins and nutrients if your mom eats meat versus she doesn't, right? Like that can influence how our brain develops, not good or bad. I'm not like saying that you should or shouldn't eat meat here, right? I'm just saying that there is an influence that womb environment actually has on our development, right? Enriched environments help develop a heavier and thicker brain cortex. If a mother is pregnant and she is doing everything that she's supposed to do, she's taking her folic acid and her prenatal vitamins, and she's drinking high-fat milk, and she's doing everything that she's supposed to do to give her baby the nutrients that it needs, right? That baby is going to have a heavier and thicker brain cortex than maybe a mother who isn't able to or doesn't know that she's pregnant or doesn't care or whatever the circumstance might be, is unable to give her baby those nutrients, right? This makes sense. Genes dictate our overall brain architecture, but experience directs the details. Like, it directs what is actually developing and how it is developing. So research has been done about this idea of experience and brain development. Basically what they did is they took rats who were born from the same parents and the same genes, and they put some of those, like sibling rats, in an enriched environment, right? They had more social interaction and physical play. They had greater access to certain like nutrients and stuff, whereas one rat was pulled aside and kind of kept in isolation. He or she, I don't know, got like the bare minimum nutrients. And you can see here that the enriched rat brain cells were far more developed than those of the impoverished rat's brain cells, right? Again, this makes sense. It's pretty intuitive. If you are being exposed to enriching experiences, things that make you like learn, and you have proper nutrients and you're healthy, right? Your brain is more able to develop stronger connections. Whereas those who are in impoverished environments, right, that don't have access to certain nutrients, that aren't consistently engaging in enriching experiences, right, they're unable to make those connections. And on top of all of this, then, we're not just like developing these connections and these neural pathways, our brain is actually like pruning all of our unused neural pathways as well to make space for new ones, right? To make our well-used brain pathways work better, the unused connections are pruned away. This means that if certain abilities are not used, they will fade. Let me give you an example. So I was in choir in high school. I went to Minnetonka High School. I think I've mentioned that before. And I took music theory, and I was a very, very good sight reader, right? I could read music, I could sing it. That's what sight reading is, right? I could tell what key a song was in. I could like do all of that stuff. Now, this summer will be my 10-year reunion. So I'm removed from that quite a bit. Now, if you were to hand me a piece of sheet music, I would look at it and be like, all right. It's really a guessing game at this point, right? And that's because my brain is pruning those unused skills. I haven't sight read in a while. Therefore, my brain isn't going to continue to try and like nourish and develop and grow those pathways. It's going to say, not worth my effort. Let's focus on, right now in this day and age, how to better our use of technology for teaching, right? Like whatever that might be. So here's an actual like visual representation of what that impact of environment can actually have on a human brain, right? Repeated practice at a finger tapping task begins to activate a slightly larger group of motor neurons the more that it's done, right? So you can see here that if you're doing just something really simple and kind of monotonous, a finger tapping exercise, you have to engage some sort of motor neurons to like actually physically move your fingers. But as you do it longer and you get better at it, you see that more of those neurons are engaging and they're growing to make you a more successful finger tapper, right? That's where the phrase, quote, practice makes perfect comes from, right? Like that makes sense. And the more that we do something and the more that we engage in a specific task or experience, right, the more focus our brain is going to put on making sure it's prepared to handle those types of scenarios or situations. We already kind of chatted about parental and peer influences, but there are some like research-founded conclusions that we can make about parenting styles and the influence that peers have on us, right? Generally, environmental influences, including parenting, account for about 10% of temperament, although a much higher percentage for other features such as values. If you have a family member who is consistently acting out and yelling and is violent, right, you will be more prone as you grow up to also have violent outbursts and have like a quick temper, right? So temperament is one of those things that is can be influenced by parenting style, but generally speaking, we're seeing a lot of our values, again, going back to that like charitable piece, those types of ideas are mostly influenced by parenting, right? In a non-abusive or like average parental relationship, this eases off on both the blame and the credit they assume for how their kids turn out, right? But we also know that the extreme pattern of abuse and neglect that some children deal with can lead to many more effects than the abused kid who becomes abusive phrase that you see in the textbook if you're referencing that, right? You can basically understand that if a child was abused within their childhood, right, that's an impoverished environment, right? They're probably not getting like the love and support that kind of, I don't like the word normal, but like a more normative child experiences growing up. They're in a constant state of fear and tense, there's a tense like environment, right? This isn't good for kids, and it doesn't just lead to like an increase in their likelihood to abuse future people in their lives, but it also can lead to anxiety, depression, flashbacks, other mental psychological disorders such as like PTSD or eating disorders, right? It also has effects to lead to unusual strengths in coping, which is more of like a positive spin on looking at children who have been abused, right? They generally are they're better at problem solving, acceptance, determination, or the ability to seek out helpful resources, which tends to be a key factor in resilient survivors of something like abuse or trauma. To switch then and look at peers, right? We know that conformity could be a selection effect. It's difficult to definitively say that like peers have this influence on people, because sometimes we choose to hang out with people because they are a certain way, right? And because this person is super outgoing and I'm super outgoing, I choose to hang out with them, right? I'm not outgoing because of the friends that are influencing me. If you get, it's kind of meta, but like you get what I'm saying, right? Correlation does not equal causation here, right? Interaction with peers can teach new social skills. So you saw things about like cooperation, style of music, those types of things, right? Parents may try to have an indirect influence by selecting a child's peers. So this may kind of undermine the influence that peers really have, because if parents are the ones that are like setting their kids up with like play dates and whatever, they're generally setting them up with people who are similar to them in terms of like socioeconomic status, like geography, all of these things. So we know that there are some like undermining potential confounding variables in this research, but generally speaking, kids are picking their own peers to hang out with, and that then has an influence on a lot of their like cultural tastes, how they dress, how they cut their hair, if they wear makeup, if they like country music, or if they like rock and roll, if they whatever, you get the drift, right? Peer influence here. So what we're going to do now, we're actually going to look at a couple of examples of how we can look at the impact that cultural influence can have on our interpretation of our surroundings. So I want you to pause the video real quick and just read through this example of Yuri, who is an exchange student from Russia, and then I'll talk through, like, I want you thinking about how does this represent cultural influence, right? How does this story give us insight into like the impact that our culture and the culture that we are raised in can have on our interpretation of what we are in fact experiencing. So pause it, read it, and then we'll come back. So hopefully you took a second and read Yuri's experience coming to the United States, and it really does pose a couple of questions, right? What is his view on Americans, and what does he base his perception on, right? People smile a lot. Why do people smile, right? Think about back in the good old days when we used to be able to walk down the hallways at the glorious Wayzata High School, and you would see somebody, whether you knew them or not, right? You'd give them a smile or a wave. You're like, hey, how's it going? Good. And you? Good, right? Like, you don't really care how they're doing, right? But it's a cultural norm to ask somebody how they're doing, right? This is kind of what Yuri is experiencing, right? Is his perception of Americans accurate, that they're just so friendly, they're going to be very close friends with everybody that invites him over, asks him how he's doing, or smiles at him? Like, that's the question. Will the friendly Americans remember the invitations for Yuri to stop by? How durable are friendships with strangers in the United States? These are cultural ideas, right? In Russia, there may be different cultural norms in which, like, you don't, in fact, smile and invite people over just to be polite, right? And so this is a new experience for somebody like Yuri, who is basing his perception of Americans from a place of a worldview of kind of Russian culture. So just think about that. We're going to look at one more example here. But when you're thinking about what culture means, right, again, a couple of questions that come up: are the signs of friendships the same everywhere across the globe? To what do friendships obligate you in the United States, right? Are the obligations the same in other cultures? Like, we are going to look just briefly here in a second at collectivist versus individualist cultures, right? Individualist cultures tend to have a lot of like surface level acquaintances, whereas collectivist cultures tend to have fewer relationships, but they're really deep and long-standing. So like, what does that look like, and how does culture then in fact influence how we perceive the world? So one more example. Look at this Dutch woman living in Paris. Pause it, read it, think about what this tells us in regards to, her culture impacting her experience. So obviously here we have a miscommunication or a misinterpretation about what a dinner invitation means, right? This could be coming from a male versus a female kind of cultural experience. This could be coming from Dutch versus Paris. This could be completely unrelated to that. But like, were either of these real or expectations unrealistic, right? Looking at the conversation and thinking about what that is, I mean, like, in today's day and age, I think that the man is definitely out of line in terms of his assumption, but it's not an unreasonable kind of conclusion for somebody to draw, right? Especially if you are raised, right? People always say that the French are kind of like, I don't even know how to describe it, but like fluffy and sexual and flirtatious and stuff. Like, that could be the culture he was raised in. And it's important to recognize, again, just that nature versus nurture piece of it, in that, like, we all experience our lives in different ways. We're influenced by different people. We live at different socioeconomic statuses. We have different jobs, which put us in contact with different, like, social issues. And that then informs how we are perceiving what's going on around us. So here you have just kind of a chart that talks a little bit about culture. I'm not going to talk through all of this. If you want to get more insight, a lot of this is pretty intuitive, right? We know that, like, culture variation can occur even within one culture. Think about, like, language, pace of life, gender equality, right? A lot of this stuff is stuff you already know. It's just a matter of applying it then to, like, our understanding of psychology. So looking at culture refers to a pattern of ideas, attitudes, values, lifestyles, habits, and traditions shared by a group of people and passed on to future generations. We've looked at examples. Feel free to pause it and jot down some of these ideas if you're interested. I just want you to have this content, but I'm not going to super dig into it right now. I do want to talk briefly about the difference between individualist versus collectivist cultures, right? I referenced this before, but there is a pretty significant difference between how those growing up in an individualist society versus a collectivist society engage with their surroundings. The United States is individualist, right? There's a priority in taking care of yourself and getting the best job that you can get and making money, and we have this capitalist structure. Neither of these ideas are good or bad or right or wrong. They're different, right? And so what can you do to better your chances to get into college, right? Whereas a collectivist society is a lot more interdependent, and their identity comes from belonging, right? They want to fit in, they work together. It's more of a group effort to get from point A to point B. Again, I referenced that collectivist relationships tend to be few but close and enduring, whereas individualist relationships tend to be many, often temporary or casual, and it's okay for confrontation to take place, right? We see behavior reflecting in one's personality and attitudes through an individualist culture, right? I'm behaving this way because that's who I am, that's how I was raised, those are my traits. Whereas a collectivist culture, behavior reflects social norms and roles more intensely. Obviously in individualist cultures, in the United States, there are social norms that we abide by, right? We raise our hand in school. We don't just kick a stranger as they walk by, right? There are certain norms that we abide by, but not to the same extent as a collectivist culture. Collectivists would put the value of those cultural norms above their own ideas and their own feelings. And this brings then kind of full circle, looking at culture and genes. We're going to talk about child rearing here in just a second, then transition into our conversation about gender. So when we're talking about culture and genes, again, it's similar to that peer influence. We don't know, oops, I dropped my pen. We can't directly conclude that one is impacting the other, right? There is a difference in average blood pressure between racial groups, but, right, that doesn't necessarily mean that race, which, by the way, is a social construct, people with darker skin or lighter skin or with more yellow pigment or red pigment, right? There's 99.98% similarity in our DNA, right? There's no genetic basis for race. It's a social construct. I digress. But it may seem as if there is a difference in blood pressure, whereas it might just be the fact that people from different cultures tend to have different color skin and tend to eat different types of food, right? Americans who are Caucasian might eat a lot of hamburgers, whereas Hispanic Americans living in Texas may eat a lot of empanadas or tacos or whatever it might be, right? And that influences blood pressure, right? So recognizing that there is potentially genetic assumptions being made when there are other confounding variables that are the actual culprit of those differences. And then the last piece here is just child rearing, right? We know that our parenting style is can even be different from person to person for kids at Wayzata High School. Some people have parents who are very strict. Some people have parents who are very lenient. Some parents want to be friends. Some parents want to be authoritative, and that's fine. Again, there's no right or wrong way to parent as long as the child is safe and loved. But we know that in individualist cultures, they are going to raise their children to be self-reliant and independent, whereas people in collectivist cultures are going to raise their children to be compliant, obedient, and integrated into the webs of mutual support, right? It's more about you fitting into the family than you thriving and doing whatever you're going to be successful at, right? So just kind of recognize all of these different experiential influences that are, in fact, influencing our behavior. So that's what I have for experience. Again, now we are going to shift our attention and talk about gender. And we're going to do that by just starting off by defining some terms. You're listening to a podcast with I've annotated it and given you written definitions while this podcast is going on, but it is very important.
P.S. You guys, this podcast that you're about to listen to / see definitions written out took me a very embarrassingly long time to make. So I hope you enjoy this. It took me so long that it was worth a little insert of me telling you how long it took me to make. So enjoy. I hope you learned something. This is really important, especially with a lot of the politics going on surrounding things like transgender rights and gay people who can or cannot be a part of the military, right? There's a lot of conversations politically around gender-specific ideas, and so it's really important that we understand the foundational terminology and definitions behind what we're talking about before we can make informed decisions. So, you're welcome in advance. Here you go.
Hey everyone, I'm Trace. Welcome to Test 2 Plus. This is a podcast-style show where we take a big topic and we get really into it. This week we're talking about gender identity. It's a very important topic, especially right now. What is gender is a big question. Why does it matter? And do we even need it anymore? These are questions we're going to get into. We should explain some terms, though. I think those are all really important. Sex and gender are both inborn and both fluid, both public and yet at the same time kind of intensely personal. So let's start with some basic concepts for what sex and gender are. Sex is a biological concept. Gender is a human and social cultural concept. In fact, all of the following things are completely independent identifiers. Gender and sex are not the same thing, although they're often used interchangeably. Sex is the classification of being male or female, and it's usually assigned at birth. When we're born, we look at a baby and we say this anatomy determines that this is a man or a woman, or will be. It's a male or a female. 1 in 2,000 births, though, has atypical genitalia. Something's missing maybe, or something's extra, something's too big, something's in the wrong place, something too small. It really does happen a lot. 1 in 2,000 might not seem like a lot, but that's a lot. So this is why using the word assignment is important when talking about sex. Someone decided that this baby is a male or a female at some point, not looking at its DNA or anything else, just looking at it. There are times when a doctor is making this decision. There's a time when this doctor is maybe wrong. For example, say circumcision was elected to be done by the parents. It's happened before where a mangled circumcision results in a change in the sex assignment from boy to girl. It's happened. Look it up. Gender, on the other hand, from sex, is the state of being male or female culturally or socially. So again, not the same as sex, it's far more fluid, and it's also more of a spectrum or a continuum. Femininity versus masculinity is one way that people talk about gender. It's not the only way. Male versus female is one way you can talk about sex, but again, not the only way. In reality, gender is non-binary. There aren't just two genders. There are many genders. Some countries even recognize a third gender group, but we'll get there. Gender identity is your internal feelings about your gender. So this is about you, not about how the world sees you, but how you see yourself. So usually it's masculine or feminine. A lot of people identify very simply masculine or feminine. But sometimes it's a mix of those. Sometimes it's neither one of those. And the thing is, when it comes to gender identity, this is something that you decide. No one can tell you what your gender identity is. Gender expression is names, pronouns, appearance, like your clothes that you wear, the hairstyle that you have. It's the outward appearance of that gender identity, and that's defined by kind of the cultural experience, but you're the one who gets to pick what that shows. A third term you're going to hear a lot is sexual orientation, and sex and gender are independent of that. Sexual orientation is physical, romantic, and or emotional attraction to another person. It's inborn. Science believes it's likely a result of epigenetics, which means it can have some inheritability, but more or less, there's no gay gene, just like there's no straight gene. But it's also not a choice and probably not changeable throughout someone's life. Your sexual orientation is usually pretty permanent. Another term is transgender. This is where people start to get a little tripped up because masculine and feminine describe so many people in our population. It's very difficult for a lot of people to understand what this means, but this is when the gender identity and/or gender expression differs from what the inborn sex assignment is. It's an umbrella term for all different gender expressions and gender identities. So that would be transgender. Transsexual is a medical term for someone whose identity or expression doesn't match that is assigned at birth. So say somebody who was born a male but felt like they were female their whole life, they may become someday transgender or transsexual. They're not entirely mutually exclusive, nor are they both used all the time for every case. It's individual. There's also agender. Agender means you're not masculine or feminine. No gender identity. Some define this as having a gender identity that is neutral, as a separate from something standing apart. It's a neutral gender identity. It's very difficult for this to be studied. I have a background in sexual education. I'm a certified peer sex educator from Western Michigan University, where I went to my undergrad, and we talked a lot about agender because it was very difficult to study people who are agender because it's not a huge population, similar to masculine and feminine people, which are very large populations. There are also things like cross-dressing. This is completely separate, again, from all these other terms, and this is a person whose clothing is their chosen means of gender expression, now that you know what that term means. And it often differs from their sex assignment, but not always. Terms to avoid in this area that a lot of people still use are transvestite. That's someone who dresses for sexual pleasure. Cross-dressing does not necessarily mean that they're getting sexual pleasure out of it. It might just mean that it conforms better to their internally held gender identity. Someone who is in transition is someone who is converting from living and working as one gender into a different gender. It's often done through their outward appearance. Sometimes it's done through surgery. Sometimes it goes as far as hormones and other measures that need to be taken in order to make the person's gender identity on the inside match their gender expression on the outside. That's when you would say that person is in transition. Everyone transitions differently, and there are different levels of transition. Not everybody goes 100% masculine to 100% feminine, and in fact, most science says that there's no such thing as people who are 100% of either of those things. Everyone is on this spectrum or on this continuum. Some people will transition part way and find their spot that they are most comfortable, and that's where they will stop. Some people, you will read about if you go and looking into this stuff, you'll find some people transition a little bit, find their spot, but transition a little farther and then come back, as in they'll maybe stop taking a hormone or they won't go through with the surgery they had planned because they found the place where they were comfortable even though they planned to go farther. This is all complicated, and you might be thinking to yourself, so if I am a masculine person who was assigned male when they were born, what am I? There's a term for you too. It's cisgender. Cisgender people are people who identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth. It's not better to be cisgender, but it's nice to know who you are, and it's part of your identity, whether you know it or not, or whether you knew it before I told you it was a term or not. It's an important part of who you are. And that's why this is complicated, because this involves human lives. And most people are going to commend others for trying. So learning some of these terms are going to make you talk to others better. And even if you use the wrong term, say you're talking about someone's cross-dressing and you use the word transvestite. Don't, but if you do, people will commend you for trying often, as long as you're not doing it in a negative way. Because this is about people's individuality. It's about affirmation. You're seeing people as they want to be seen, and that's important. So a good place to start was somewhere that I learned to start in college, which was, instead of saying a member of the opposite sex, how many times have you heard people say that? The opposite sex implies that there is one sex and then there is the opposite, like there is the opposite side of a quarter. In reality, it's the other sex. It's not the opposite. You're not two sides of the same coin. You're two parts of a greater spectrum or continuum. Identity is everything to so many people, and it's very personal, and it's very important. And being misunderstood or having your deeply held beliefs cast aside, it's hurtful. It makes everyone feel terrible, no matter what they identify with on the inside. So obviously, I don't know everything about this. I have done some training, but I haven't done it in a long time. So things have changed even since I was certified. They've probably changed since I started doing some of this research 2 years ago on D News. But that's why we're here to talk about it. And having a different opinion or a different understanding of this is really important to us. So please let us know. You can tell us in the comments, or you can tweet at me if you'd like. And just remember, be respectful. We're discussing actual people here. But I think it's important also to find other terms for some of these things. There are terms that I didn't get to in this episode, so make sure you share those in the comments. And you can find out tomorrow what the science says about all of this stuff. So subscribe for more Test Tube Plus. Last week we talked about aliens. Super exciting stuff. We had our first guest ever, Dr. Ian O'Neill, astrophysicist. Really, really cool. Thanks for watching Test Tube Plus. We'll see you tomorrow.
So hopefully that podcast gave you kind of the foundation that you need moving forward when conversing in everyday life about gender ideas, and also a foundation for us moving forward when we're talking about kind of the nature versus nurture debate as it pertains to gender, right? That podcast referenced a couple of kind of scientific studies and like understandings behind like things like sexual orientation, sexual identity, or gender identity and gender expression, and whether these things you're born with them or if they're something that you choose or that are learned, right? Like that was referenced. So we're going to look at that in just a little bit more detail by starting with the biological gender differences. So this is the nature side of kind of the nature-nurture debate. Here we see that biologically, male or female chromosomes are either made up of an XX chromosome, which leads to somebody being biologically female, that is their sex, and an XY chromosome would be biologically male, or their sex would be male, right? And you guys looked at this too with your genetics web quest, so you kind of know this, but like it is important to recognize the difference between sex and gender because they are different, and they reference that in the podcast. But the biological gender for men and for male babies who are born, their testes develop, and at 7 weeks the testes produce a flood of testosterone, then leading them to become, of course, their biological sex to be male. That does not necessarily mean that they are going to identify as male as they grow older, right? And so we know that hormones guide the development of external sex organs. So more testosterone would lead to the development of male sex organs, and more estrogen would lead to the creation or the development of more female sex organs. So we are going to watch a video here real quick, but we do want to just reference like the brain differences between males and females, right? During the 4th and 5th months of pregnancy, sex hormones bathe the fetal brain, right? So female brains are, as this says, bathed in estrogen, whereas male brains are bathed in testosterone. And throughout adulthood, women have thicker areas in part of the frontal lobes that helps with verbal fluency. We also know that females tend to mature both physically and mentally quicker and sooner than boys, right? That's why I can't remember what the exact numbers are, but like females are said to be fully developed, their brains and their bodies by age, I think it's like 24, and men, it's not until they're like 28 that their brain is done developing. But like those are some brain differences that have been scientifically studied and proven, right? There are also differences in the amygdala, hippocampus, and the ratio of cell bodies to axons. So we're going to watch this video that goes into a little bit more detail about the differences of the brain. We're going to talk about where kind of our gender identity and the development of our gender identity comes from, and how gender roles in our cultures plays a part in that development. And then we're going to end the conversation by watching a TED Talk about Disney. So let's watch this and then we'll continue on.
I think we've all heard this saying, men are from Mars, women are from Venus. The implication being that they are just completely, totally, fundamentally distinct. But say you picked up a male brain and a female brain and compared them. Like you squeezed them and you poke them and prod them, and this is kind of a gross example. I don't think we should be playing with brains. Put the brains down. The question is, if you looked at a male and female brain side by side, would you be able to see any differences? Well, the answer is super controversial, and you probably wouldn't be able to tell with the naked eye, but like, maybe? The better question is, would it even matter if you could? Now, it's important to note that we're talking about biological sex here, not gender. Almost all of the studies on brain anatomy have been done with people whose gender identity aligns with the sex they were assigned with at birth, which means we can't really apply their results to people with other gender identities. Same for people who are intersex, meaning their chromosomes or reproductive anatomy don't fit the typical binary. With that in mind, though, we can ask whether there are fundamental differences in brain anatomy between biosex males and females. And there are a lot of good reasons to ask that. Outdated stereotypes like the idea that males are better at math aren't one of them, but there are differences between males and females that are pretty well supported. For instance, females are more frequently diagnosed with disorders like depression and anxiety and have higher rates of Alzheimer's. Biological differences in the brain, if they exist, could help explain and treat these diseases. And then there's the fact that most of science just doesn't use female animal models. A 2010 study of sex bias and research found that neuroscience was one of the guiltiest fields, and that male animals were studied more than 5 times as often as female animals. There are reasons for this, including the fact that lab mice go into heat every 4 to 6 days. I mean, if you thought PMS once a month was bad, try factoring that kind of hormonal haywire into your nicely controlled scientific experiment. But if human male and female brains are different, then not studying female animal models is a pretty big problem. So are sex-related anatomical differences a thing or not? Well, yes and no. The one consistent finding is that male brains are bigger on average than female ones, which makes sense because generally male heads are bigger. Bigger bodies, bigger body parts. Other studies suggest that there are differences in specific brain regions, or that for females, some regions have thicker cortices, the folded gray matter on the outer edge of the brain that we use to do our higher level cognition. But findings vary by study, and all of them depend on whether or not you correct for the larger size of the male brain overall. When you do, some of the results disappear, and some stay the same, and some even flip which sex is larger, though again, different studies have had different results. And whether or not to do that kind of size correction is still hotly debated by scientists. Some researchers point out that larger brain structures are still larger brain structures no matter what size your body is. Those extra neurons gotta be doing something, right? And we make all this fuss about our brains being bigger than those of other primates because we assume that size matters. But it's not like we think sperm whales are vastly more intelligent than we are, even though their brains are more than 6 times the size of ours. So most studies investigating behaviors or disease conditions look at the relative size instead. Indeed, the very fact that a lot of sex differences disappear once you correct for relative head size suggests that maybe it's worth taking a second look at. For example, a 2018 study, which is perhaps the most comprehensive to date, looked at the brains of 2,750 females and 2,466 males and found that anatomical differences did exist and were statistically significant. On average, females had thicker cortices in 48 of the 68 brain regions examined, but males had larger brains and larger brain regions and structures. When the size of the brain was accounted for, though, the sex differences in the size of most of these regions disappeared. So did the size differences in structures, like the hippocampus, caudate nucleus, and thalamus. And females ended up having larger relative volumes for 10 regions as well as the right nucleus accumbens. But the differences in size of these structures, absolute or relative, were small, and there was a lot of overlap. So if a particular structure was really big or really small, it might be associated with a particular sex. But plenty of different sizes for a given structure could be considered totally normal for males or females. And previous studies had found that while there are average differences between the sexes, individuals don't necessarily have male or female brains. Researchers in a 2015 study of 281 brains brains found that individuals often have like a quote-unquote mosaic of male-ish and female-ish brain characteristics, rather than all their structures tending toward one sex. What conclusion can be drawn from all of this? Well, despite all the controversy, there might be some small differences on average between male and female brains. And that does kind of make sense. After all, males and females have different chromosomes and are exposed to a different set of hormones both prenatally and throughout our entire lives. Despite that, though, a lot of social psychologists and sociologists point out that it's impossible to know how much of these sex differences come from biology and how much come from environmental influences. The brain is famous for being plastic, after all. And it makes sense that if playing video games alters your brain, how you were raised and treated and act alters your brain too. But there's also an assumption underlying all this debate, which is rarely questioned, that these differences correlate to sex-specific differences in cognition or behavior. The thing is, there's not much evidence that that's true, and there might be a reason for that. One interesting theory some psychologists have is that size does matter, but that the anatomical differences between the sexes compensate for any cognitive differences that might otherwise arise because of sizing. So that relatively large right nucleus accumbens or the thicker cortices of females don't make them act or think differently than males. It ensures they don't, despite the males' larger noggins. And even if size does matter, bigger isn't necessarily better. There simply isn't a lot of evidence that actually connects anatomical differences in brains to behavior or cognition, unless you're talking about things like malformations, lesions, or serious brain damage. And remember phrenology? That super cool trend in the 1800s of using the lumps and bumps on a person's head to make judgments about their thoughts and personality? Yeah, that one made everybody look silly. So as usual, there's a lot more work to be done to figure out what all this means. But for now, you can be pretty skeptical of anyone trying to use brain anatomy to justify any argument about differences between the sexes. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow Psych. If you want to keep exploring the wonders of brains large and small, be sure to click that subscribe button.
So there you have some of the biological differences, the differences in the brain. We're going to, like I said, shift our attention to the nurture side of gender roles, right? First, let's define that, in that it's behaviors that are expected of people related to their identity as men and women, right? Things like women are stay-at-home moms who do the dishes and clean and take care of the kids. Men are dads who go to work and make money to support their families, right? Girls, it's okay to cry. Boys, it's not. Boys, it's okay to be violent and angry. Girls, it's not, right? These are culturally established gender roles and expectations surrounding how people are supposed to, quote unquote, you can't see me doing air quotes, supposed to behave based on how they identify. Here's a graph that shows kind of a change over time in regards to like what roles women are taking within the workforce, right? You see females with their PhD in psychology is continuously going up. Law school graduates, medical school graduates, those go up, right? And we know that, and we're going to talk about this piece of it a lot more in AP Psych if you take it next year. But a lot of the bias that exists surrounding, like, when you think about a police officer, your prototype of that police officer is generally like a stout male in a blue suit and a hat, right? Why is it a male, right? That's because gender roles in our culture have kind of taught us to think of certain professions as male or female. Now, I want to say, obviously, even by these graphs are old, but like obviously this is changing, right? There are a lot more women going into engineering. There are a lot more women going into medicine than like in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, and even later on, right? Like this is a changing trend, but we also know that there are gender inequalities that still exist. The pay gap is real, and it exists between men and women. And so a lot, again, like, it's really important that we have an understanding of these gender terms and the basics of gender so that we can, in fact, communicate and articulate our own perspectives on what's going on within society more fluently and more productively. So then the question still remains, right? Is there a cultural influence on gender role development, or is it instinctual, right? Are children who are born male or female more likely to behave a certain way because they are male or female biologically, or is it something that's taught to them over time? The social learning theory says that we learn gender role behavior by imitation and by rewards and punishments that shape our behavior. Again, that idea of like, if you are a young girl and you grow up and your dad fixes the car and changes the oil, and your mom cooks and does the laundry, right? Like, that's your interpretation of what a mom and a dad does, right? And that's inherently establishing your understanding of gender roles as you grow older. Fun fact, my dad always did our laundry. That was funny. I also know that like this idea of rewards and punishments shaping our behavior, this is like the, if a girl gets angry, right, and they get in trouble for getting angry, like, don't act like that, right? They're going to be less likely to act angry in their future, whereas if a boy acts angry, it's not the same response. Generally speaking, it's how can we calm you down, not like you can't do that, right? Same thing with crying. Like, how many of you have heard, like, tough boys don't cry, boys don't cry, what are you, a girl, right? Like, if a boy is crying, that's another one of those punishments and reward type of like training to say like boys aren't supposed to cry, but it's okay if girls do. If a girl's crying, they don't say like, oh, toughen up. They just kind of let it happen. We also know that gender schemas are the cognitive framework for developing concepts of male and female. These frameworks guide our observations, right? Once we start to develop our understanding of gender roles, that's what we perceive on a day-to-day basis, right? Even if somebody is breaking down those roles and those norms, we're still going to, we'll forget those, right? Because they don't fit into our gender schema. We're going to remember the stuff that reaffirms what we already believe. And then the last one here, gender typing is the instinct which drives some children to fit into traditional gender roles, right? This idea that like mom and dad told me I'm a cute little girl that wears pink dresses and bows, and so I'm going to be a cute little girl who wears pink dresses and bows because that's what I feel I'm supposed to do. So we know that there are a lot of different approaches to understanding gender and how it relates to psychology, and we also know that a lot of things influence our individual development, right? There are biological, psychological, and sociocultural influences that you can see here, right? Biological, our human genome, our DNA. Our psychological is really focusing on our like beliefs, feelings, expectations, our responses evoked by our own temperament. And then we have like our social cultural influences, what our parents think, what our peers think, what like our greater society and culture thinks. And all of this kind of is in an interplay with us actually developing our own concept of who we are and how we fit into all of it. So that's what I have for you for gender. We are going to watch a TED Talk now. Obviously, it's about 13 minutes long. And it says, or it's called How Disney Teaches Manhood. Right? We've seen a lot of study and research done. This is like one of my favorite TED Talks of all time. But we've seen a lot of studies and research done about like how little girls identify with the female characters in these Disney movies, these princesses, and how like if a princess is seen as like weak or needing help, like how that reaffirms this idea of like women needing men to be successful, right? And that like the end goal in life is to find a prince and get married and live happily ever after. We've seen a lot of this. But what we don't always get to see, or what's not always talked about, is how little boys are identifying with the male characters, right? And how those male characters are interacting with women and the female characters of the movie, right? So watch this TED Talk. It's very interesting, and it really does kind of give a new perspective into our understanding of gender and how culture and what we experience can influence our own interpretation of who we are and what our own individual identity is.
my favorite part of being a dad is the movies I get to watch. I love sharing my favorite movies with my kids, and when my daughter was 4, we got to watch The Wizard of Oz together. Totally dominated her imagination for months. Her favorite character was Glinda, of course. Gave her a great excuse to wear a sparkly dress and carry a wand. But you know, you watch a movie enough times, and you start to realize how unusual it is. Now, we live today and are raising our children in a kind of children's fantasy, spectacular industrial complex. But The Wizard of Oz stood alone. It did not start that trend. 40 years later was when the trend really caught on, with, interestingly, another movie that featured a metal guy and a furry guy rescuing a girl by dressing up as the enemy's guards. Do you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Now, there's a big difference between these two movies, a couple of really big differences between The Wizard of Oz and all the movies we watch today. One is there's very little violence in The Wizard of Oz. The monkeys are rather aggressive, as are the apple trees. But I think if The Wizard of Oz were made today, the wizard would say, Dorothy, you are the savior of Oz that the prophecy foretold. Use your magic slippers to defeat the computer-generated armies of the Wicked Witch. But that's not how it happens. Another thing that's really unique about The Wizard of Oz, to me, is that all of the most heroic and wise and even villainous characters are female. Now, I started to notice this when I actually showed Star Wars to my daughter, which was years later, and the situation was different. At that point, I also had a son. He was only 3 at the time. He was not invited to the screening. He's too young for that. But he was the second child, and the level of supervision had plummeted. So he wandered in, and it imprinted on him like mommy duck does to its duckling. And I don't think he understands what's going on, but he is sure soaking in it. And I wonder what he's soaking in. Is he picking up on the themes of courage and perseverance and loyalty? Is he picking up on the fact that Luke joins an army to overthrow the government? Is he picking up on the fact that there are only boys in the universe except for Aunt Beru? And of course, this princess who's really cool, but who kind of waits around through most of the movie so that she can award the hero with a medal and a wink to thank him for saving the universe, which he does by the magic that he was born with. Compare this to 1939 with The Wizard of Oz. How does Dorothy win her movie? By making friends with everybody and being a leader. Like, that's kind of the world I'd rather raise my kids in. Oz, right? And not the world of dudes fighting, which is where we kind of have to be. Why is there so much force, capital F force, in the movies we have for our kids and so little Yellow Brick Road? I mean, there is a lot of great writing about the impact that the boy violent movie has on girls, and you should do that reading. It's very good. I haven't read as much on how boys are picking up on this vibe. I know from my own experience that Princess Leia did not provide the adequate context that I could have used in navigating the adult world that is co-ed. I think, there was a kind of first kiss moment when I really expected the credits to start rolling, because that's the end of the movie, right? I finished my quest, I got the girl, why are you still standing there? I don't know what I'm supposed to do. The movies are very, very focused on defeating the villain and getting your reward, and there's not a lot of room for other relationships and other journeys. It's almost as though if you're a boy, you are a dopey animal, and if you were a girl, you should bring your warrior costume. I mean, there are plenty of exceptions, and I will defend the Disney princesses in front of any of you. But they do send a message to boys that the boys are not really the target audience. I mean, they are doing a phenomenal job of teaching girls how to defend against the patriarchy, but they are not necessarily showing boys how they're supposed to defend against the patriarchy. There's no models for them. And we also have some terrific women who are writing new stories for our kids. And as three-dimensional and delightful as Hermione and Katniss are, these are still war movies. And of course, the most successful studio of all time continues to crank out classic after classic, every single one of them about the journey of a boy, or a man, or two men who are friends, or a man and his son, or two men who are raising a little girl. Until, as many of you are thinking, this year, when they finally came out with Brave. I recommend it to all of you. It's on demand now. You remember what the critics said when Brave came out? Oh, I can't believe Pixar made a princess movie. It's very good. Don't let that stop you. Now, almost none of these movies pass the Bechdel test. I don't know if you've heard of this. It has not yet caught on and caught fire, but maybe today we will start a movement. Alison Bechdel is a comic book artist, and back in the mid-'80s, she recorded this conversation she'd had with a friend about assessing the movies that they saw. And it's very simple. There's just 3 questions you should ask. Is there more than one character in the movie that is female who has lines? So try to meet that bar. And do these women talk to each other at any point in the movie? And is there conversation about something other than the guy that they both like? Right? Thank you. Thank you very much. 2 women who exist and talk to each other about stuff. It does happen. I've seen it, and yet I very rarely see it in the movies that we know and love. In fact, this week I went to see a very high-quality movie, Argo, right? Oscar buzz, doing great at the box office, a consensus idea of what a quality Hollywood film is. Pretty much flunks the Bechdel test. And I don't think it should, because a lot of the movie, I don't know if you've seen it, but a lot of the movie takes place in this embassy where men and women are hiding out during the hostage crisis. We got quite a few scenes of the men having deep, angst-ridden conversations in this hideout. And the great moment for one of the actresses is to peek through the door and say, "Are you coming to bed, honey?" Like, that's Hollywood for you. So let's look at the numbers. 2011, the 100 most popular movies, how many of them do you think actually have female protagonists? 11. It's not bad. It's not as many percent as the number of women we've just elected to Congress, so that's good. But there is a number that is greater than this that's going to bring this room down. Last year, the New York Times published a study that the government had done. Here's what it said. 1 out of 5 women in America say that they have been sexually assaulted sometime in their life. Now, I don't think that's the fault of popular entertainment. I don't think kids' movies have anything to do with that. I don't even think that, music videos or pornography are really directly related to that. But something is going wrong. And when I hear that statistic, one of the things I think of is that's a lot of sexual assailants. Who are these guys? What are they learning? What are they failing to learn? Are they absorbing the story that a male hero's job is to defeat the villain with violence and then collect a reward, which is a woman who has no friends and doesn't speak? Are we soaking up that story? As a parent with the privilege of raising a daughter, like all of you who are doing the same thing, we find this world and this statistic very alarming, and we want to prepare them. We have tools at our disposal like girl power, and we hope that that will help. But I gotta wonder, is girl power going to protect them if at the same time, actively or passively, we are training our sons to maintain their boy power? I mean, I think the Netflix queue is one way that we can do something very important. And I'm talking mainly to the dads here. I think we have got to show our sons a new definition of manhood. Now, the definition of manhood is already turning upside down. I mean, you've read about how the new economy is changing the roles of caregiver and wage earner. They're throwing it up in the air. So our sons are going to have to find some way of adapting to this, some new relationship with each other. And I think we really have to show them and model for them how a real man is someone who trusts his sisters and respects them and wants to be on their team and stands up against the real bad guys, who are the men who want to abuse the women. And I think our job in the Netflix queue is to look out for those movies that pass the Bechdel test, if we can find them, and to seek out the heroines who are there, who show real courage, who bring people together, and to nudge our sons to identify with those heroines and to say, I want to be on their team, because they're going to be on their team. When I asked my daughter who her favorite character was in Star Wars, you know what she said? Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan Kenobi and Glinda. Now, what do these two have in common? Maybe it's not just the sparkly dress. I think these people are experts. I think these are the two people in the movie who know more than anybody else, and they love sharing their knowledge with other people to help them reach their potential. Now, they're leaders. I like that kind of quest for my daughter, and I like that kind of quest for my son. I want more quests like that. I want fewer quests where my son is told, go out and fight it alone, and more quests where he sees that it's his job to join a team. Maybe a team led by women to help other people become better and be better people, like the Wizard of Oz. Thank you.
So there you have it, experience, gender, kind of, again, tying this all together, this nature versus nurture debate, tying it all together and thinking about, like, yeah, we know the genetic side of things, we know the nature, right? How does nurture, how does our environment, how does what we experience on a day-to-day basis impact why we behave the way that we do? So with that, you guys are done for the day. Again, tomorrow, make sure you hop on Canvas, you look at the list of movies and documentaries that you can watch. There's 4 of them. They should all be available via different platforms. If you have a difficult time, like gaining access to one of them, feel free to shoot me an email. We'll figure something out. Also, if you think of a movie or a documentary that relates to this nature versus nurture debate or gives you like a different perspective that you've been wanting to watch or that you have seen and want to watch again that's not on my list, feel free to just shoot me an email and be like, hey, can I watch this one instead? Make sure you check with me, but like totally open. You're totally able to pick something as long as it's relevant to what we're talking about here. So have fun with that. As you know, if you have questions, I'll be available both Wednesday and Thursday. Your FRQ is on Wednesday. I've said this a couple of times, but do make sure that you're accessing the terms list on the homepage of Canvas, because that's going to give you an itemized list of what I'm expecting you to come into that FRQ knowing, right? The test is timed. You have 60 minutes to complete it. Therefore, you're not going to have time to like look stuff up, double check. You're going to be focused on answering the questions and answering it thoroughly, right? Reference my feedback from the FRQ, the first FRQ, right? What am I looking for, right? You're not just like giving me
a 2-sentence response. This is more thoughtful than that. You might even want to re-reference back in Canvas announcements. I went over and I had like a little Zoom meeting and I talked about what my expectations are for these FRQs. You can watch that video back. So does, you should be defining terms, you should be connecting terms, and making sure that you are proving to me that you do in fact know this content. And I'm not going to know that unless you are defining and applying, right? So keep that in mind. A couple of resources for you. Again, if you have questions, shoot me an email. I'll be available. Yeah, have fun watching your movie tomorrow, and I will catch up with you guys on Thursday after the FRQ. You'll have a couple of days away from me and my voice.